Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. If you have been with me from the beginning of this, thank you so much for being here. If you are just joining, thank you so much for being here. If you joined in the middle, all around, thank you for being here. This book has been really, it has been an intense read. It's been a heavy read, but it's been such an important read. And I am so proud of the people that have gone along this journey with me and have continued with it, and I'm excited to see what comes from this and how we're able to use this as part of our continued decolonizing and dismantling systems of oppression. If you are reading along with me with the actual book, we are on page 118. We're still continuing with chapter 4, Rolling Back Civil Rights. We're going to be starting on the first full paragraph, but a third of the way down on page 118. Hailed as one of the most popular and even greatest presidents, Ronald Reagan oversaw the rollback of many of the gains African Americans had achieved through the civil rights movement. Between 1981 and 1988, conditions regressed to levels reminiscent of the early 1960s. Journalist Hodding Carter described Reagan as, quote, part Wallace and part Nixon, and a more effective Southern strategist than both put together. Reagan's aura of sincerity and aw shucks geniality lent a welcoming, friendly facade to any harshness of the Southern strategy, something that neither Nixon's brooding nor Wallace's angry countenance had ever been able to convey. Reagan, therefore, positively oozed racial innocence in his declaration of fealty to states' rights at the all-white 1980 Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, cited the triple murder of civil rights workers. In a 1981 interview, GOP consultant Lee Atwater explained the inner logic of, as one commenter noted, racism with plausible deniability. You start out in 1954, Atwater laid out, by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes. And all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that. And then he deflected. He then deflected. It was a role tailor-made for the former Hollywood actor. Reagan cast himself as a traditional conservative, but his disdain for supposed big government was geared not so much toward New Deal programs that had provided paid employment to millions of out-of-work Americans like his father, or Social Security, which had overwhelmingly benefited whites during the Great Depression. I'm going to stop there for a minute. Ronald Reagan was an actor before he became president. And Ronald Reagan is, in my opinion, arguably one of the worst presidents that we've had. And we're going to get into this with some of his politics and policies. But who else do we know that was president that came from the entertainment world, that had one appearance but showed up a different way? Where were we? What President Reagan loathed was a great society that, despite its dispersal of benefits to middle-class whites and its measurable effectiveness in lifting the elderly out of poverty, he succeeded in coding as a giveaway program for blacks. His budget priorities reflected that contempt as he ordered a scorched earth policy through the Great Society, from education to housing to employment. Despite his profession of and supposed obsession with a colorblind society, where, as he said, quote, nothing is done to or for anyone because of race, Reagan's budget proposals targeted very specifically those programs in which blacks were overrepresented, even as he protected the other portions of the social safety net, such as Social Security, where African Americans were but a small fraction of the recipients. For example, almost 5 times as many black college-bound high school seniors as white came from families with incomes below $12,000. The administration reconfigured various grants and loan packages so that, quote, the needier the student, the harder he or she would be hit by Reagan's student aid cuts. The needier the student, the harder he or she would be hit by Reagan's student aid cuts. Not surprisingly, nationwide black enrollment in college plummeted from 34% to 26%. Thus, just at that moment where the post-industrial economic economy made an undergraduate degree more important than ever. 15,000 fewer African Americans were in college during the early 1980s than had been enrolled in the mid 1970s, although the high school graduation numbers were by now significantly higher. Nor had the fallout happened only at the baccalaureate level. The plunge in undergraduate enrollment, which no other racial or ethnic group suffered during this time, cascaded into a substantial decline in the number of African Americans in graduate programs as well. While access to higher education was crumbling, the Reagan administration also established enormous roadblocks to quality K 12 public schools for African American children. The president cavalierly stated that he was, quote, under the impression that the problem of segregated schools has been settled, end quote. The Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, William Bradford Reynolds, agreed, and when he learned of an effort in South Carolina to dismantle what amounted to Jim Crow education, he was determined that Black parents, whom he referred to as those bastards, would have to, quote, jump through every hoop, end quote, to file a lawsuit to desegregate the public schools in Charleston. We are not going to compel children who don't choose to have an integrated education to have one, Reynolds insisted. Under Reynolds and Attorney General Edwin Meese, the Department of Justice used virtually every legal strategy to dismantle, obstruct, and undermine the only remaining alternative to integrate schools, busing, including torpedoing a plan to finally desegregate a school district in Louisiana that had openly fought Brown since 1956. Already hampered by the Scylla and Charbrise of Milliken and Rodriguez, Black children's passages through the education system became even more difficult during the Reagan years. The Detroit decision meant that children were, for the most part, locked inside their cities and their neighborhoods, while Rodriguez meant that those city and neighborhood schools would remain or become even more impoverished. And now the Department of Justice seemed determined to advocate segregated schools as a remedy, putting its considerable weight on the side of the status quo of inequality. Moreover, the Reagan administration exacerbated that inequality even further as it shredded the safety net. Not even school lunch programs geared towards those in the greatest economic need were sacred, the Christian Science Monitor reported, as they came under attack when President Reagan trimmed $1.46 billion from $5.66 billion earmarked for child nutrition programs, children eating. He also leveled a double-digit cut for a program designed to provide educational support for poor children in the classroom at the very moment when the share of Black youth living below the poverty line had increased to almost 43%. The 1980s revealed just how fragile the economic recovery of African Americans was in the wake of 350 years of slavery and Jim Crow. From the 1960s to the 1970s, the Black unemployment rate had declined, and the gap between Black and white unemployment rates had actually narrowed. By the time Reagan's policies had taken effect, however, not only had Black unemployment rate increased, but also the unemployment gap between Blacks and whites had widened to unprecedented levels. During the early 1980s, the overall Black unemployment rate stood at 15.5%, and quote, an all-time high, end quote, since the Great Depression, while unemployment among African American youth was a staggering 45.7%. At this point, Reagan chose to slash the training, employment, and labor services budget by 70%, a cut of $3.805 billion. The only urban program that survived the cuts was federal aid for highways, which primarily benefited suburbs, not cities. In keeping with Lee Atwater's mantra that, quote, Blacks get hurt worse than whites, Reagan gutted aid to cities so extensively that federal dollars were reduced from 22% of a city's budget to 6%. Cities responded with sharp austerity measures that shut down libraries, closed municipal hospitals, and cut back on garbage pickup. Some cities even dismantled their police and fire departments. Reagan further destabilized the economic foundation for African Americans by ordering massive layoffs in federal jobs while deliberately weakening the enforcement of civil rights laws in the workplace. Blacks are disproportionately employed by the government, not least because the public sector suffers demonstrably less discrimination in hiring and compensation than private industry. More than 50% of the growth in employment for Black workers in the United States between 1960 to 1976, in fact, was in the public sector. But that avenue into economic stability, even for the college educated, was now threatened by two key developments. First, the federal government's layoffs were concentrated in the social service agencies, where many African Americans worked. Reagan had exempted the Department of Defense, for example, while making it clear that, quote, other divisions of government would be hit especially hard by the employment reductions, end quote. When one agency was abolished in 1981, jobs for 900 workers, 60% of them Black, were wiped out. Then, the Department of Health and Human Services, a major agency for Black employment, absorbed about half of the 6,000 layoffs scheduled for 1982. The second development assaulting the job security of Black civil servants was the administration's decision to put the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which was a federal watchdog for employment discrimination, on ice. The second development assaulting the job security of Black civil servants was the administration's decision to put the EEOC, which was a federal watchdog for employment discrimination, on ice by making the agency utterly ineffective. Reagan appointed inadequate and often incompetent leadership. He was especially keen to select African Americans, such as future Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who believed there was no group discrimination against minorities or women, certainly nothing that would warrant class action lawsuits. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where you have a certain belief and you need something to make that true. When you see confirmation bias in race relations, that means that you feel a certain way about a certain race or a group of people, and then you find a person within that group that is exhibiting internalized oppression, and in this case, internalized anti-Blackness, and you go to them and say, look, this person agrees with me. Clarence Thomas, Eric Adams, Candace Owens, the list goes on and on. Under this new management, the agency slowed down to a crawl its investigation and processing of complaints. The result was a growing backlog whose legal shelf life expired before the EEOC even got around to investigating. The watchdog had been effectively muzzled. With the rollback now in full force, the civil rights gains of the past, as National Urban League President Vernon Jordan remarked, were now under attack and in danger. The median family income for African Americans had been higher in the 1970s than it was under Reagan, even as the white median income, despite the economic downturn, continued to grow. As a result, the actual spending power of Blacks decreased while that of whites rose, increasing the gap by 12%. In virtually every area of life that counts, wrote David Swinton, future president of the United Negro College Fund, Black people made strong progress in the 1960s, peaked in the 70s, and have been sliding back ever since. The Reagan administration's deplorable policies and efforts to turn back the clock ensured it. Indeed, by 1990, Blacks in the bottom 20% were poorer in relation to whites than at any time since the 1950s. Not surprisingly, the National Urban League labeled the president's policies a failure that has ushered in a new era of stagnation and decline for the vast majority of average Black Americans. Reagan's job cuts, retooling of student financial aid to eliminate those most in need, and decimation of anti-poverty and social welfare programs virtually ensured that the goal of the African American community for economic stability and progress would crumble and fade. In March 1981, Reagan assured reporters that, quote, he would offer a national drug abuse program that would put its main effort into warning young people about the dangers of drug use rather than into attacks on narcotics smuggling. But by October 1982, the president had obviously changed his mind. In a gripping address, he explained that a scourge had invaded the nation's borders, taken hold of American families and children, and was laying siege to cities across the land. Hardest hit, the president conveyed, was the garden spot of South Florida, which had, quote, turned into a battlefield for competing drug pushers who were terrorizing Florida's citizens, end quote. The president then laid out a potent multi-agency agency strategy using military intelligence and radar that could hone in on drug traffickers and execute brilliant interdiction strikes to cut off drugs before they left other countries' borders. There was just one problem. There was no drug crisis. There was no drug crisis in 1982. Marijuana use was down. Heroin and hallucinogens, we're going to leave that, use had leveled off. Even first time cocaine use was bottoming out. But as Reagan well knew, such a crisis was certainly coming, for it had been manufactured and facilitated by his staff on the National Security Council, the NSC, along with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. In these last throes of the Cold War, Nicaragua was a target, but the collateral damage would spray south central Los Angeles and then radiate out to, you guessed it, Black communities all across the United States. In 1979, after a coalition of moderate and Marxist Nicaraguans overthrew longtime U.S. ally and ruthless dictator Anastasio Somoza, communist Sandinistas came to power in Managua. Reagan did not see this as a homegrown revolution born out of intolerable conditions of greed, torture, and human rights violations. Instead, he was sure that the Sandinistas were no more than Soviet stooges ensconced by Moscow to foment revolution in America's backyard. The president was, therefore, obsessed with eliminating the Sandinistas. Shortly after taking office, Reagan ordered CIA Director William Casey to do whatever was necessary to support a small band of anti-Sandinista guerrillas known as the Contras, most of whom were strays from Somoza's feared and hated National Guard. Reagan followed up on November 23, 1981, with a directive to funnel $19.3 million through the CIA to the Contras. But that was not enough, argued Enrique Bermudez, the founder of the guerrilla group. They needed much more. Then in December 1981, Reagan signed a secret order authorizing Contra aid for the purpose of disposing the Sandinistas. The only question was where to get those funds. There was simply a limit to the depths that the CIA and National Security Council budgets could tap into finance the Contras. Congress, meanwhile, already stung by the debacle in Vietnam, was not about to loosen the purse strings. And so at a 1981 meeting, Contra-level leaders who Reagan referred to as the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers floated the idea that trafficking cocaine into California would provide enough profits to arm and train the anti-Sandinista guerrillas. And so, at a December 1981 meeting, Contra leaders whom Reagan referred to as the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers floated the idea that trafficking cocaine into California would provide profits to arm and train the anti-Sandinista guerrillas. There's a level of insidiousness to all of this. Ronald Reagan, again, arguably one of the worst presidents that we've had. What we're reading right now is we're getting into where he created this drug crisis that he was so concerned about. He created this drug crisis so that he could fund his group to extinguish and exterminate another group. With most of the network already established, the plan was rather straightforward. There were the Medellin and Cali cartels in Colombia, the airports and money laundering, and please, there are going to be some words that I likely mispronounce, and please forgive me. Perfection is not what we're looking for here. The airports and money laundering in Panama run by President Manuel Noriega, the well-known lack of radar detection that made landing strips in Costa Rica prime transport depots, and weapons and drug warehouses at Ilopango Air Base outside San Salvador. The problem had been U.S. law enforcement guarding key entry points into a lucrative market. But with the CIA and the National Security Council now ready to run interference and keep the FBI, the U.S. Customs Service and the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, in check, the once formidable line of defense had swindled to a porous nuisance. Reagan's moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers was now ready to saturate the United States with cocaine. Initially, Nicaraguan exiles Oscar Danilo Blandon and Norwin Meneses, whose nickname was El Rey de las Drogas, the King of Drugs, set up their wholesale operations in San Francisco. But although they had the product, they didn't yet have the distribution network to move the initial shipment of cocaine into the rural markets. That came only when they managed to link up with Rick Ross and the not the rapper, Rick Ross, an illiterate yet entrepreneurial black man who became the conduit between the Contra drug runners and the Crips and Bloods gangs in LA. The result was nothing less than explosive. From the Contra wholesalers, top quality cocaine was then packaged and sold in little rocks of crack that reaped more than $230,000 per kilo in retail profit. Now, drug money and all its attendant violence pounded on a population with double digit employment and declining real wages. The logistical strength of the Bloods and Crips, with an estimated 50,000 gang members, spread the pain as they set up drug franchises throughout the United States to sell crack like it was on the dollar menu. Soon, crack was everywhere, kicking the legs out from under black neighborhoods. While the new self-created drug crisis threatened the security of millions of African Americans, the administration focused its efforts on facilitating greater access to weapons for the rebels purchased with off-the-books money. In 1982, Vice President George H.W. Bush, the former director of the CIA, and his national security advisor, Donald Gregg, a former CIA agent, worked with William Casey to run a program named Black Eagle, which was designed to circumvent Congress and funnel weapons to the Contras. As the logistical pipeline solidified, it became clear that Manuel Noriega would be essential to this operation. Through a series of top secret negotiations, U.S. officials worked out landing rights at Panamanian airfields for the Black Eagle planes to transport weapons to the Contras and the use of Panamanian companies to launder money. Noriega was already in a $400 million partnership with the Medellin cartel, who was already in a $400 million partnership with the Medellin cartel, seized on the profitability of this deal with the White House and began to divert Black Eagle planes and pilots for drug-running flights to the southern United States. The Reagan administration's response to what should have been seen as a diplomatic affront, especially since the president had tapped George H.W. Bush to lead the drug and interdiction activities in South Florida, was telling and disturbing. The administration simply required the Panamanian president to use a percentage of his drug profits to buy additional weapons for the Contras. Thus, although Reagan bragged to the American public about using military resources to, quote, to cut off drugs before they left other countries' borders, end quote, his staff's shielding of Noriega and the Colombian traffickers, in fact, actively allowed cocaine imports to the United States to skyrocket by 50% within 3 years. The Medellin cartel's cut alone was $10 billion a year in sales. The Reagan administration's protection of drug traffickers escalated further when the CIA received approval from the Department of Justice in 1982 to remain silent about any key agent assets that were involved in the manufacturing, transportation, or sale of narcotics. This network of White House protection for major drug traffickers swung into full gear once Congress, through a series of amendments in 1982 and 1984, shut off all funds to the Contras and banned U.S. material and financial support for the overthrow of the government in Nicaragua. Undeterred by the law, the Reagan administration simply ramped up the alternate and illegal streams of revenue it had already devised: drug profits and arms sales to Iran. At this point, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Deputy Director of the National Security Council, stepped in to create the larger, more dynamic operation that would soon replace Bush's Black Eagle. North brought to the work both a military efficiency and a truly amoral focus. Years later, even when under congressional Klieg lights, he seemed to imply that the breaking of laws was appropriate. Quote, "I remain convinced that what we tried to accomplish was worth the risk," he said. North understood that his role, working with his CIA counterpart, Dwayne Claridge, was to ensure that the Contras had weapons. Congress had cut off all funding, so profits from cocaine would have to become an alternate source. That warped the framing of the Contras needs led North to facilitate the trafficking of cocaine into the United States, which included working with the CIA to transport 1,500 kilos of Bolivian paste, diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars in, quote, humanitarian aid, end quote, to indicated narcotics traffickers, and refusing to pass the names of known drug runners on to the appropriate authorities. He also saw to it that the millions of dollars in profits from the sale of narcotics were then funneled safely out of the U.S., and that those funds went to arms dealers, especially in El Salvador and Honduras, who could equip the Contras with everything from boots to grenades. The FBI learned that the North's NSC, brandishing the pretext of the interests of the national security, routinely intimidated customs and DEA officials to back off from making good narcotics cases. Moreover, Blandon and Meneses, who trafficked at least 5 tons of cocaine, or the equivalent of 16.2 million rocks of crack into California, quote, led a charmed life, end quote, as the NSC and CIA blocked police, sheriffs, and the DEA from stopping the flow of drugs and money. Similarly, in the summer of 1986, North was Manuel Noriega's champion in the halls of power. The New York Times had run a series of articles citing well-placed sources in a Defense Intelligence Agency report that the Panamanian president had tight control of drug and money laundering activities in and out of the country, and therefore, although making only $1,200 a month, had a personal fortune of several $100 million. It was too much even for Senator Jesse Helms, a Republican from North Carolina, an ultra right wing senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee, who then went on Meet the Press and branded Noriega, quote, head of the biggest drug trafficking operation in the Western Hemisphere, end quote. The barrage hit too close to the truth, and North's attempt at damage control swung into action. He confided to his boss, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, quote, you will recall that over the years, Manuel Noriega in Panama and I have developed a fairly good relationship, end quote. And now, given the media onslaught, the dictator needed the Reagan administration's help in cleaning up his image. North was eager, but, he continued, it was going to cost. The dictator's terms were simple. In exchange for $1 million and a PR blitz from the White House, Noriega offered to destabilize the Sandinista government. At first, Poindexter wobbled. Was this a setup? Quote, so that he can blackmail us to lay off, end quote. Reagan's national security advisor, however, quickly set aside those initial qualms and authorized North to open negotiations with Noriega, noting, quote, I have nothing against him other than his illegal activities, end quote. Secretary of State George P. Shultz was on board as well. The CIA this time refused to play along. The agency, quote, didn't want to do it, just didn't want to touch that one, end quote. But North was adamant. Noriega, who was instrumental in flooding the United States with cocaine, was a valued asset. North even swooped in to rescue a major Contra ally who was arrested by the FBI with 345 kilos of cocaine, was a valued asset. 345 kilos of cocaine. The lieutenant colonel, using the full authority and aura of the NSC, weighed in on the court and had the drug kingpin sentence reduced by 75% down to 5 years. And the locale of incarceration changed from a maximum to minimum security club fed. We're going to stop there. We're on page 129. We just finished the full paragraph. We're still in Rolling Back to Civil Rights. As you can see, there's a lot of information there. So there's a few things that we covered in this chapter. The changing of words to stop being so offensive. So stop using the flat out word nigger, but then changing it to redlining, housing, taxing, all of these things that are still going to directly affect Black people, but say it in a way that is racism light. It is going to be that I'm not touching you racism, where there is not the covert excuse me, the overt racism, but there is a covert ways that are still directly affecting Black Americans. You have the president of the United States, who manufactured a drug crisis to which he then over policed Black people for. He manufactured this drug crisis where he had cocaine coming to California and switched it to crack cocaine because cocaine is expensive. Crack cocaine is cheap. So he brought cocaine into South Central Los Angeles, where it was able to be cooked down to rocks, to be sold to Black Americans to further create oppression. All of this was created by the powers that be, the administration, the ghettos that were spoken about, the ghettos that you hear about. The ghettos were created by the administration by blocking access, by changing, by stopping garbage. So there was garbage piling up. All of these neighborhoods that people will classify as low income or troubled neighborhoods, these were all creations of previous administrations. So when Black people say that everything that we are currently oppressed by has been created by our very oppressors, this book, as we go through it, is an indication of how that's true. When you think about how Reagan created this group to fight, and it tied into funneling money and weapons, and just kind of, if you scratch my back, I scratch yours. It makes me think of currently with our current administration in Israel and the IDF, and how there are these deals that overall cause harm and destruction and eradication of communities and genocide, but it is benefiting the administration that's currently in the White House. History is a continuation of itself. It just looks differently. This is why when we talk about what the different administrators are doing, it's all an offshoot of what the people before them did. But what really sticks out to me is that when we talk about this, the 60s and the 70s were the most lucrative time for Black Americans. It does not mean that it was an easier time, but it was a more lucrative time. Things were working kind of in our favor so that we could at least be able to take care of ourselves. And Ronald Reagan, through his hatred of Black people, came in and uprooted and upended all of that. And another thing that's important to think about is the way they described him. Ronald Reagan, for who he was, especially in the 80s, he did have the sheepish grin. He seemed really likable. He seemed charismatic. He was the one that originally said, "Make America Great Again," because people thought that's what it needed. He was, by all viewpoints, a person that seemed like a person that we wanted, that we could trust. Meanwhile, he knew what to say and what to do to get him into this position of power, to therefore continue to violently oppress Black Americans to the point of illegal activities. Again, when I say that history is continuing itself, if Ronald Reagan has no enemies, that means that I'm dead. By the way, I could spend hours talking about Ronald Reagan. Your journal prompts for this book. Again, we're continuing on with how you are seeing things continue from history to current day. Continue to draw those parallels where you're seeing it, especially with talking about this drug crisis, especially talking about what Ronald Reagan created as a way to oppress other people, and then seemingly make it those people's fault, making it Black Americans' fault. I want you to also think about how you have viewed these neighborhoods that have been called ghettos or low income. Think about how you have viewed them and why you have viewed them that way, and how your thought process has potentially changed by hearing how they were manufactured by the people in power, how those were created to continue to further oppress Black people. How is your thinking changing knowing the origin of how they got there and why they were created? 2 journal prompts. And that's kind of where we're going to leave it right now, because those are some pretty good ones. And we want to finish out this chapter when we meet up again next week. If you're looking for something extra to do before we meet too, I also encourage and invite you to look more into Ronald Reagan. Look more into Ronald Reagan, and think about also too, might be a journal prompt or something to think about. Think about how in your life you might have been bamboozled, let's say, by somebody who showed up one way, but that had their hidden agendas behind it. But they knew what to do to seem likable, to seem jovial, to seem curious and sheepish, and somebody that we should just listen to because This looks like a good guy. Think about when that's happened to you or if that's happened to you. Again, I am so proud of you for going on this journey with me. I'm proud of you for deciding to make this part of your decolonizing journey. And I am so happy that you're here with me. And we will continue this again next week. In the meantime, make sure to stay hydrated.